After our visit to Mario Zucchelli's station, the intention was to head southeast initially, skirting around the toe of the Drygalski ice tongue, a 70-kilometre long extension of the David Glacier. We would then head straight to Cape Royds on Ross Island, some 320 kilometres or about 24 hours sailing. We arrived at the glacier at midnight, in time to see the sun both set and rise simultaneously, as we were now far enough south to be in constant daylight. Well, here we are at 20 past midnight, and guess what? The sun's still shining very, very brightly. Unfortunately, the ice trapped at the toe of the ice tongue was too thick to penetrate, and we were forced to backtrack north to Cape Washington before heading east across the Ross Sea. Here we met up with the cause of the ice blockage, a mighty chunk of ice named Iceberg B15J. Icebergs are named according to which of the 4 quadrants of the polar hemisphere they come from. B15 had calved from the Ross Ice Shelf in Sector B in late March of the year 2000. The carving occurred along pre-existing crevasses in the ice shelf that had been preserved in the journey from the 3,000-metre high polar plateau down to the Ross Sea. Iceberg B15 measured 295 kilometres long by 37 kilometres wide, an area of 11,000 square kilometres. Imagine a single iceberg stretching from Foster to Wollongong in New South Wales. Other comparisons might be New York to Nantucket or Edinburgh to York in the UK. During January 2001, a weather station and GPS instruments were installed on B15, which gave valuable information on iceberg movements in the Southern Ocean over the next 5 years. Most icebergs just meander around the coast of Antarctica, as shown in the red lines in this diagram. B15 was different because it was so big it broke free from Antarctica and finished up somewhere near New Zealand. In 2002, B15 broke into several pieces, the largest of which were designated B15A, with an area of 6,400 square kilometres, and B15B of 4,000 square kilometres. Not only did the lumbering monster B15A destroy the emperor penguin colony at Cape Crozier when it collided with Ross Island, but over the next 2 years it prevented the sea ice breakup in the western Ross Sea, creating supply problems for the stations in McMurdo Sound. The Adelie penguin colony at Cape Royds declined from over 8,000 birds to just a few hundred, because it added 50 to 70 kilometres to their journey for food, so most starved to death. B15J split off B15A in October 2003, remaining grounded off Ross Island while B15A floated free and began drifting northwest towards the Drygalski ice tongue. Drifting north in the Ross Sea current, in April 2005, B15A collided with the Drygalski ice tongue, breaking off an 8 square kilometre piece, which fortunately did not seem to affect either of the ice masses. B15A ran aground off Cape Royds in October 2005, and several smaller pieces broke off. The principal agent of the breakup was a previously unknown 9-kilometre long ridge with minimum depths of 215 metres that has been labelled Davy Shoal. The iceberg was driven into the shoal by coastal currents that converge over the narrow continental shelf. For the next 12 months, B15A meandered north across the Southern Ocean. In November 2006, several large pieces were spotted just 60 kilometres off the coast from Timaru, south of Christchurch, New Zealand. The largest was about 2 square kilometres in area and still 37 metres high above the ocean. Meanwhile, the 110-kilometre long iceberg B15J hung around the western Ross Sea, forming a barrier to the sea ice breakup in Terra Nova Bay in early 2008, and thus blocking our passage south. The necessary detour added 16 hours travel time. We finally broke out into open water 24 hours after departing Mario Zucchelli Station and began to sail southeast beside Iceberg 15J for 6 hours. Around midday, while traversing the iceberg, much to everyone's surprise, we came across what appeared to be a fishing trawler heading in the opposite direction. Given that this was the only vessel that we had seen since leaving New Zealand, it's no wonder the encounter generated a lot of interest. Could it be a Japanese whale catcher for a mothership nearby? In fact, it was the New Zealand polar research vessel RV Tangaroa, Tangaroa being the Maori god of the sea. Around 70 metres long, she carries a crew of 18 and on this voyage also had 26 scientists on board, including some from other nations such as the United States and Italy. Tangaroa is moderately ice-strengthened and can only handle sea ice up to 40 centimetres thick, unlike the more robust Marina Sveteva, so we were surprised that she had made it through the pack ice into the Ross Sea. Nevertheless, this vessel enables New Zealand to punch far above its weight in the realm of Antarctic marine science. By 3 p.m. we were near the southeast end of the iceberg. A prominent ice rampart rose well above the otherwise flat surface of the iceberg, probably a relic of one of the many collisions it must have endured. Beyond the rampart, the ice trapped behind the iceberg prevented us from turning south for some time. We then zigzagged our way through the abundant sea ice, past Franklin and Beaufort Islands, towards Ross Island and Cape Royds. In places the sea ice was quite heavy and progress was slow. Around midnight we were nearing Ross Island and into the Polynya. A polynya is an area of open water resulting from the katabatic wind from the high interior, pushing the sea ice away from the unprotected parts of the coast. As the wind strength rose to gale force, the temperature fell and at 5 a.m. was steady at -12 degrees Celsius. We anchored in Backdoor Bay just off Cape Royds about 6 a.m. and prepared to go ashore immediately to a landing spot at the southern end of the bay. We clambered ashore onto slippery, fast ice, which was a bit of a challenge. Our experienced guides led us carefully across the ice, stopping where necessary to chop steps, and also mark the safest route, which was sometimes only a metre from a crevasse. My video camera then told me that it was too cold for the battery to operate, and it would shut down in 30 seconds. Not surprising, since with the wind chill factor, it was like -26 degrees Celsius. Background across the bay. Across the ice field that we've just walked over. I guess over the hill there will be Shackleton's hut. Just over the low saddle was a small basin, with Shackleton's Nimrod hut nestled beside it. The Nimrod designator refers to the name of the ship which brought the British Antarctic Expedition, led by Shackleton on his second trip to Antarctica, and his first time as leader. Starting with Borchgrevink in 1898, it became the tradition to name the various British Antarctic expeditions after the expedition ship. Thus, Borchgrevink's was the Southern Cross Expedition, followed by Scott's Discovery Expedition of 1901 to 1904. A Merchant Navy sub-lieutenant, Ernest Shackleton, was a member of Scott's team on the Discovery, but was invalided home with scurvy after their attempt to reach the South Pole. They got about halfway there. My YouTube video on Shackleton's Nimrod Expedition tells the full story of Shackleton's remarkably successful follow-up scientific and exploration endeavour, in which Shackleton got to within 180 kilometres of the pole, 600 kilometres closer than he had achieved with Scott. Shackleton's experience with Scott in 1901-02 had whetted his appetite for further exploration of Antarctica, in particular the discovery of what lay south of the Great Ice Barrier, first encountered by James Clark Ross in 1841. That enormous glacier, one of the world's largest, is more fully described in my YouTube video on the Great Ice Barrier. By early 1907, Shackleton had a plan of campaign, but little money to implement it. However, Edgeworth David, Professor of Geology at Sydney University, persuaded the Australian government to contribute £6,000, equivalent to 1.2 million US dollars in today's money, and other contributors brought the funding up to £30,000, enough to fund the expedition. As well as about 400 tons of supplies, including 255 tons of coal, and equipment for polar exploration, Shackleton had a prefabricated hut specially constructed by Humphreys Limited of Knightsbridge. Humphreys were renowned for manufacturing tin tabernacles, from the Latin word for tent, meaning temporary dwellings. Their flat-pack, movable, corrugated iron hospitals proliferated all over England, mainly as isolation hospitals for smallpox outbreaks. For Shackleton, Humphreys used hardened spruce for framing, with vertical tongue-and-grooved pine for cladding instead of their usual corrugated iron. After being erected and inspected in London, the itemised parts of the timber hut were numbered to facilitate re-erection and shipped in sections in the Nimrod in late 1907. In 1957, the room occupied by my class at school that year was a tin tabernacle, manufactured in England by Humphreys Limited and erected on site in Adelaide in 1907, a year before Shackleton's hut. Geologist Dr. Cecil Madigan, a participant in Mawson's Antarctic expeditions, was also an inhabitant of the tin tabernacle at some stage. The temporary classroom remained in use for 90 years. Shackleton intended to sail south from Lyttelton in New Zealand to the Great Ice Barrier and follow it east to King Edward VII Land, first seen from discovery in 1901 by Scott and Shackleton, where he proposed to establish his base. The adjacent Bay of Whales is 130 kilometres closer to the South Pole than Ross Island, and was used in 1912 by Amundsen as the base for his successful race to the pole. However, an impenetrable field of pack ice blocked any hope of reaching King Edward VII Land. Shackleton saw no alternative but to steer for McMurdo Sound and establish his winter quarters there in an area with which he had considerable familiarity. Unfortunately, it was the same story in McMurdo Sound, where heavy pack ice prevented Nimrod from reaching Scott's former expedition discovery hut in McMurdo Sound. Shackleton settled on Cape Royds as the site for his base, as the sea ice blocking access seemed to be breaking up quickly. By 10 p.m. on the 3rd of February, Nimrod was able to approach within 100 metres of shore and moor to the fast ice. Shackleton and Professor David went ashore to choose a site for the winter quarters hut. As soon as they returned, having successfully chosen a location, unloading of the cargo onto the ice began. From there, the stores were dragged by sledge to the hut site, all done in a heavy snowstorm. Next day, rising seas broke up the ice wharf and Nimrod was forced to move out to sea, returning in the evening when the weather moderated. All the horses and more cargo were unloaded overnight. To facilitate unloading from the boats, a derrick was rigged above a shoreline cliff. On February 6th, the party began erecting the prefabricated hut section. It took 10 days to dig the foundations into the frozen, rocky ground and fix the wooden framing into place with a mixture of cement and cinders. Over a further 3 weeks, the building was insulated with felt and granular cork, clad with pine board. The hut was ready for occupation by the end of February. It measured only 10 metres long by 5.8 metres wide. Shackleton commented that the hut was not a very spacious dwelling for the accommodation of 15 persons, but our narrow quarters were warmer than if the hut had been larger. Warmth was far more valuable than space during the harsh Antarctic winter. We made our way down to the hut and dutifully lined up to take our turn to see inside. Only 8 people are permitted in the hut at any one time. The building has been extensively renovated by the Antarctic Heritage Trust, and a plaque on the entry door cautions visitors to preserve this priceless historical site. Compromises had to be made during the restoration. The pine boards had shrunk, leaving gaps, so as a matter of expediency the gaps were covered with timber battens, a practical but inauthentic solution. The door surrounds deteriorate rapidly, so in 1977 the entry door was rehung on the opposite side to the original. A new door was fitted in 2007, replicating the original. Through the entry door, on the left is Mawson's laboratory, which appears to have been the repository for a stash of whisky. Some of the 45 cases of McKinley Highland whisky bought by Shackleton. There is also a pulley wheel, possibly the one used for the derrick in 1908. Box shelves in the passageway outside the lab contain a range of tools. The expedition's supplies had been packed in 2,500 venesta cases, a form of plywood. Progressively emptied, these were made into shelving, bunks, furniture, and a host of other uses. Sitting above the inner entrance door is a bright orange Drummond acetylene generator. This provided acetylene gas to light the 7 lamps inside the hut. It works by automatically dropping potassium or calcium carbide into water, the chemical reaction producing acetylene gas. The boxes beside the generator contain calcium carbide pellets. Once inside the hut, the first order of business is to sign the visitor's book. The entrance to Shackleton's cubicle, the only private space in the hut, is just to the left of the image. The cubicle now is almost bare. Looking around the main room, you feel as though you've walked in just after the occupants had left. Laundry and socks are strung up to dry. Pots still sit on the stove, ready for a brew of tea or a hearty stew. A fur sleeping bag is airing on a bunk. Tins of succulent Edwardian-era food line the many shelves, while boxes of candles are there ready to light, although curiously made expressly for hot climates. 2 sledges hang from the roof. They have been moved from their locations at the time the hut was occupied by the Nimrod expeditioners. Sleeping arrangements were very basic, with little privacy apart from the occasional rudimentary curtain. On the left northwestern corner of the hut is the space occupied by Mawson and Professor David, dubbed the pawn shop, adjacent to the dark room. Today it is a lot tidier than it was in 1908. David brought with him a state-of-the-art stereographic Graflex camera, with the photographs intended as a personal record. The camera was far too heavy and bulky to take on sledging expeditions. Next to the pawn shop was the Rogue's Retreat, occupied by zoologist Ernest Joyce and Frank Wild, who had accompanied Scott and Shackleton on the previous Discovery expedition. Shackleton had brought with him a complete professional printing facility. This was presented to him by Joseph Corston and Sons. The firm undertook to give Wild and Joyce instruction in the art of printing and typesetting before they left London. The package included 2 presses, a letterpress for text and a linotype press for printing diagrams and sketches. The objective was to produce a magazine during the winter, following Scott's example, but Shackleton was determined to go one better. He became editor-in-chief of the first volume ever to be published in the Antarctic, entitled Aurora Australis. The work was very painstaking and time-consuming, an ideal project to occupy the long, dark Antarctic winter. Just one font was used, the individual letters carefully set by hand in the wooden typesetting frame. The completed typeset page frame, known as a galley, is locked on the bed. The type is then inked using a roller to give even coverage. A sheet of paper from the many reams donated to the expedition by Abbey Mills is carefully placed on top of the galley. Some leftover reams still remain in the hut. The paper size is called executive and is 190 by 267 millimetres. Several thick sheets are then placed on top as packing, known as a timpan, and the bed rolled under the platen using a hand crank. A handle on the press is pulled forward to apply heavy pressure, pushing the ink onto the paper. The handle is pushed back, the bed rolled out, and the printed page lifted off. Voila! A similar process was used for the sketches by the expedition artist George Marston, but instead of type he used a knife to etch lino and an aluminium plate as timpan, a new innovation. Marston and Bernard Day, the mechanic for the expedition's Arrol Johnson car, shared the space opposite the Rogue's Retreat with the linotype printer and a patriotic poster of King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra. Bernard Day was the bookbinder for the project, fashioning the bindings out of Venesta board, like in this copy held in the National Library of Australia. Nothing remains of the thriving printing works in the hut. We know that the Albion Press was brought back to England because it appeared at the exhibition along the embankment in 1909, as shown in this photo from the Illustrated London News. Its whereabouts now is not known. In later years, people at Corsten and Sons were of the opinion the press had been stolen. Well-thumbed copies of the Illustrated London News lie on Day's bunk, presumably brought on the relief ship, as they are dated August 1908. They were avidly devoured by the news-starved expeditioners. Bertram Armitage, the scion of a famous Australian pastoral family that amongst other things founded Geelong Grammar School, had served in the 6th Dragoon Guards in the Boer War. Shackleton signed him up in Melbourne to train and manage the Manchurian ponies. Armitage shared space with Sir Philip Brocklehurst, the young assistant geologist. Being close to the stove, it was probably a very cosy nook. The cast iron stove is a Mrs. Sam model made by the Essie Company, founded in 1854 in Edinburgh by James Smith, Stephen Wellstood and George Ewer. The company is still in the same business today. James Murray, another expedition biologist, had a cramped space behind the stove to prepare his specimens. The rations for the expedition are a microcosm of Edwardian tastes, although bear in mind that the items we see are those left behind and may not be truly representative of the expedition members' tastes. Some, if not a lot, of the food was generously donated. A few of the choices may look rather unappetising by today's standards. Perhaps that explains the choice of some of the medicines. John Moyer and Son supplied tin rations to the British Army in the Boer War, receiving a royal warrant from King Edward VII in 1901. They were a major supplier to Scott and then Shackleton, even providing helpful advice as to how best to use their products. Their cannery in London processed succulent British meat, while their Spanish factory in Seville produced marmalade and other jams. The now empty space in the centre of the hut was occupied by a long table that was the centre of activity for the expeditioners throughout their stay. Meals, including the midwinter feast, were a time to gather and chat. Afterwards, entertainment included the playing of gramophone records. In summer, even the penguins were invited to enjoy a musical interlude. The sewing machine was kept busy, although some of the products were less than ideal. Sledges were prepared for the coming of spring. My videos on the Nimrod Expedition will provide more details on those wide-ranging exploratory journeys. Outside the hut there are stables for the Siberian ponies and a garage for the motor car brought as a trial. Both areas were enclosed and insulated in 1908. A spare wheel for the car leans against a pile of boxes. The car was not a raging success. It was heavy, lacked traction on the ice, and the petrol engine performed poorly in the extreme cold. It was taken back to New Zealand with the returning expeditioners, where it vanished without a trace. The ponies also proved much less useful than the faithful husky dogs. 2 dog kennels are still preserved outside. The hut is located beside a significant Adelie penguin rookery. Adelie penguins like sites that are free of snow and ice to breed, building nests of small stones that they collect or steal from one another. They also need to nest next to ice-free water, such as polynyas, to minimise the distance they have to walk to go fishing. Iceberg B15 nearly wiped this colony out in 2000 to 2003 because ice blockage was too wide for the penguins to cross to get food. Supposedly the numbers had recovered to about 600 by 2008. One wonders what they made of the space-suited aliens intruding their patch. Once we had explored the hut and surroundings, small groups began to dribble back across the ice sheet to the pickup point, following the black rock markers to avoid disappearing into a crevasse. As the cloud lifted briefly, we caught a glimpse of Mount Discovery to the south. At the pickup point, it was once again a slippery scramble down the edge of the ice into the inflatables. And then back to the ship for a very welcome hot breakfast. The weather was clearing and it was still only early morning, so it was up anchor and head west to look at the dry valleys.